Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We are so glad to have you here with us today. I'm going to give everyone a second to populate into the room with us here, but absolutely take a second. We would love for you to introduce yourself, your organization, and where you're from in the chat. We like to see where everybody's coming from, how you found your way here. So this is a good opportunity to introduce yourself and say hi. Just typing that out for you. Welcome on in, everybody. Even just another 30 seconds or so. Welcome on in. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you here with us today for why it's important to have workplace testing and how would marijuana rescheduling impact it. We are joined by Patrice Kelly, the president of Patrice Kelly Consulting, and we're going to get started right now. We are sponsored by, I do work for the Drug Free America organization, Drug Free America Foundation. We're a drug prevention and policy organization committed to developing strategies and educational programs that prevent drug use and promote sustained recovery. So that's our kind of overhead organization. I, in particular, am the program manager for the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance, also known as NIDWA. We're the workplace division, surprise, surprise, of Drug Free America Foundation. We want to be a national leader in the drug-free workplace industry by directly assisting employers, stakeholders like yourselves, providing drug-free workplace program resources, assistance, and supporting a national coalition of these workplaces and service providers. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself and your organization in the chat box. One thing that I will ask you to do that just makes my job a lot easier is to make sure when you have questions, not if, but when, we're really looking forward to having a discussion with you today. You pop those questions in the Q&A box. And we'll answer them as time allows. All right. So I got to move my mouse back over to my second screen so I can actually hit the down button. If I click off into the chat box, it gets upset. All right. The content here provided is for educational purposes only, based on industry expertise, which is fantastic. It is not legal advice, express or implied. Please consult legal counsel before acting or not acting on any information presented today. Presenter opinions may not reflect those of Drug Free America Foundation or the National Drug Free Workplace Alliance, but we're all hand in hand today. So the sound is echoing. All right, Christian, let me see.
Not echoing to us. Nope, it is not.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Because you had two open. Hey, been there, done that. Absolutely been there, done that. All right. We are so happy to welcome Patrice Kelly here. Patrice was the longest serving director of the Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy and Compliance at the US DOT before retiring in 2025. Congratulations. Patrice wrote or substantively provided input into many of those DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations after 1992, and authored the DOT's 2023 oral fluid testing regulation, which I'm sure many of you have questions about today. Leading trusted advisor to secretaries of transportation, federal agency leaders, White House personnel under many presidential administrations, and congressional staff, Patrice was the federal government's top expert in DOT drug and alcohol regulations, policies, and national drug control policies for transportation. Patrice is the expert's expert, domestically and internationally, and that's why we are so glad for her to join us today and walk us through marijuana rescheduling in the workplace and what we should be doing about it. Hand it over to her.
Okay, thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance for inviting me to speak today, as well as the Drug-Free America Foundation. I appreciate that. So as an overview, we'll start looking at some of the areas that you all asked me to delve into. What started federal civilian drug testing? What's the history of DOT regulated drug testing? Why do we even have workplace testing? What does rescheduling of marijuana mean? How would rescheduling of marijuana to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act impact DOT regulated as well as non regulated testing? And what do employers need to know to maximize the effectiveness of their workplace policies? And these slides will be available after the presentation, right, Heather? So we're good to go. Next slide, please. Let's go right into what started federal civilian drug testing. Well, there was already military drug testing since the Vietnam War, but in 1986, President Ronald Reagan issued the Executive Order 12564, which stands in place through this day. And in that order, he acknowledged that drug use is having serious adverse effects, costs people billions of dollars of lost productivity. And he characterized the federal government as an employer for these purposes, concerned with the well being of its employees and successful accomplishment of its work, and the need for employee productivity. These are all things we can kind of identify with in the private sector. The federal government, as the largest employer in the nation, he felt could and should show the leadership of achieving a drug-free workplace. And when federal employees use illegal drugs on or off duty, this tends to lessen productivity, lessen reliability, and it does make people prone to greater absenteeism. Next slide, please. So that order established that the Department of Health and Human Services would establish the scientific and technical aspects. So they would be in charge of the science as well as the technical aspects of how federal drug testing would be done. They could go with the military laboratories and the military ways, but we were talking about civilian drug testing. And President Reagan realized that the military system didn't exactly convert well over to the employee system for civilians. And so he established HHS to be the ones in charge and vested them with the appropriate authority. And in giving them the authority, it's very important for later discussion in marijuana rescheduling that President Reagan defined the term illegal drugs as a controlled substance included in Schedule 1 or 2. So notice there is no Schedule 3. And President Trump has talked about rescheduling to Schedule 3. Next slide, please. So the US DOT implemented drug testing because, frankly, there were just too many accidents that occurred because of marijuana use. So all the other drugs kind of got pulled along because marijuana was causing problems. And there had been some subway accidents in New York City in 1985, as well as the Conrail train collision with Amtrak. Amtrak was filled with a bunch of students and people coming back from their holiday breaks in early January of 1987. And I actually have a typo. It's 16 fatalities, 170 injuries. But there were approximately 600 people on that train whose lives were changed that night when two Conrail operators decided they would toke it up. They missed repeated signal lights and they rammed a passenger train. So in response to that, that really got everybody's attention. President Reagan was already on this issue, and DOT issued its notice of proposed rulemakings in 1987. So the same year as the Chase, Maryland accident, they literally hunkered down in rooms in FAA, in the equivalent of federal motor carriers today. It was federal highways back then, et cetera. They all hunkered down in rooms and wrote these regulations, put them out. The final rules went into effect in 1988. So again, we're talking the year after the accident, and full implementation was completed by the smallest of employers by April 15th, 1990. The large employers were expected to get going in 89. So this all went into play very quickly. Next slide, please. So the dating phase. I have for many years explained this to folks as I explained earlier that President Reagan set up Health and Human Services, HHS, to set the scientific and technical aspects of this. So, with HHS driving the science and the technical guidelines, they established a national laboratory certification program. And DOT said, hey, that's actually a really good model for us to follow. We're transportation people. We don't know the science of drug testing. We don't have the experts who could certify and then continue to adequately inspect laboratories. So let's take a look at that HHS program and see how it goes. Well, meanwhile, as I said, this was all set up in 87, 88. Congress was also looking into these issues. And Congress knew DOT had a great big gaping hole with alcohol. DOT was not allowed to test for alcohol. The courts kept rejecting the cases because alcohol was a legal substance. So Congress knew if DOT was going to be testing for a legal substance, then Congress needed to act. So Congress came out with the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991. When they were doing this, they also said, hey, about those drug testing regulations. DOT, we think what you're doing is great. They said DOT should continue with its regulations and update them as needed with time. But Congress was also had their eye on that Chase, Maryland accident. They had their eye on the other accidents that had happened. And so they went forward with the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act. When they did that, they said, DOT, that was a great idea for you guys to use HHS for the science and the technical aspects. We're going to make it absolutely mandatory for you to do that from now on. So starting in 1991, it was no longer a dating relationship. It was a shotgun wedding. There was no way DOT was authorized to leave HHS for the science. And remember, we're hearkening back to the fact that HHS has no authority to test for Schedule 3, and DOT is tied into that. So DOT has no authority to test beyond Schedule 1 and 2 either, because Congress put the two together. If Congress hadn't done that 34 years ago, there would have been a lot of other things DOT could have done, including hair testing and just made a lot more progressive and innovative steps. But they were married, inextricably combined with HHS. Next slide, please. So let's look at the bigger picture. Why have workplace testing overall? Let's start with the fundamental principle that you'll hear repeated throughout this presentation. No employer ever needs to allow an employee to work while impaired. There is no state in the United States of America that requires the employer to allow impaired employees to continue working. And I mean, think of it this way. Would you allow somebody to keep working if you knew they had COVID and they were sitting at their desk and had just been diagnosed? Would you want them in your workplace if they had the flu? And they came in and said, I tested positive yesterday at my doctor. I got the flu. Is that what you want in your workplace for health and safety purposes? But for impairment, it goes deeper. We're talking about safety. It may not just be an airline pilot. As a matter of fact, all the airlines do company testing. Most of the big truck companies do company testing because they feel that the DOT testing just doesn't cover enough people and enough types of incidents. Do you have people who operate forklifts? Do you have people who move merchandise around your customers? And the customers would be very badly injured if the shipment that is being moved fell on them. Think of Home Depot, think of some of those other places. There is really an issue about workplace safety, workplace health. We're talking about absenteeism. We're talking about people who are functioning without having their full cognitive senses or their full reflexes in place. Workplace productivity. I mean, is anybody working with a budget that's so lucrative that they don't care if anybody works in their business? And if so, that budget won't be so lucrative after a little while. You want to be able to improve employee reliability. Absenteeism is an issue, and even just the accurate and safe work of the employee is about employee reliability. So, federal government doesn't have insurance; they're self-insured. But private employers can get up to 20% off their insurance premiums for workers' compensation if they implement drug testing. And I've learned that both regulated employers like trucking companies and airlines will get those discounts, as well as people who just say, no, you know what? I run a landscaping company, and before I implemented drug testing, people were cutting their feet off. And after drug testing, it didn't so much happen. And so my insurance premiums have gone down, and I've received acknowledgement that I have mitigated this risk effectively. So, next slide. So, employers, do you have employees whose actions can endanger the safety of themselves and others? There are an awful lot of vehicles that are not covered by DOT. Your local delivery vans, your private planes, your buses that you use for your employees or that you use on property. Those fall below the commercial categories on the DOT lists. They're just not considered to be major commercial operators, but they can have the same safety repercussions. Doctors, nurses, medical technicians, dentists. How about first responders or those who must carry guns for work? Are you concerned about whether or not they're safe and reliable and accurate and able to respond appropriately? Construction workers up on your rigs, climbing scaffolding, forklift operators, as I mentioned earlier, those who work with cutting implements. One of the early things that I encountered when I was with the Federal Aviation Administration in the 90s is that as our inspectors went out and started inspecting companies, somebody was telling them the story about the local landscapers had started drug testing because just too many people were using drugs and working for the landscaping company and literally, as I mentioned earlier, losing hands and feet to these large cutting implements. So, do you have employees who have different jobs but should be drug tested? I mean, you're going to get questions from OSHA and others if you're testing your receptionist or if you're testing somebody who you just really don't have a good argument about health and safety of others in your company and your clients. But think about it and give it serious consideration, remembering that no employer ever needs to allow an employee to work while impaired. So maybe you just want to have reasonable suspicion and reasonable cause testing. Testing gives a deterrent effect. That just is risk mitigation. If I know that I'm subject to testing for certain drugs, I'm not going to use those drugs. And as a matter of fact, what we found in the DOT model is even though we have a 5 panel for which we test, it deters employees from using a whole spectrum of drugs because they're not sure if that would also trigger their drug test result. They just know exactly what you're looking for, even if you declare it ahead of time. If somebody doesn't want to use drugs, you're giving them another reason. If somebody does want to use drugs, you may be saving their life by giving them a reason not to use. Next slide, please. So let's talk about rescheduling of marijuana. On December 18th, to an awful lot of people's disappointment, President Trump signed an executive order to move marijuana to expedite an already existing process of moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. And I say it's disappointing because from a lot of different aspects. I think a lot of us were expecting that legalization could become an issue at the federal level, but rescheduling kind of hits us sideways. Schedule 3 drugs are the drugs you get from your pharmacy. They are dispensed by licensed pharmacists who make sure you have the correct dosage. Marijuana is a plant. How exactly do you dose and dispense marijuana? Oh, maybe through dispensaries, except dispensaries are not overseen in any real way by their states. Dispensaries are not run by pharmacists. Dispensaries don't have the capability to actually dose and dispense. And so, what happens to the other Schedule 3 drugs? If we allow if we allow dispensaries to do this instead of pharmacies, does that mean you can start picking up your benzodiazepines at your local dispensary too? It just doesn't fit. Rescheduling of marijuana is just a very odd concept. And it really doesn't get the marijuana people to where they want it to be either. So the reality is we're facing this, but it is awfully strange. So nothing has changed yet. The Attorney General needs to take a final action on the rulemaking that's been pending since the Biden administration. And we won't have a final answer until that is addressed. Next slide, please. So if marijuana is moved from Schedule 1 means there's no medical use and it's highly addictive, to Schedule 3, where there is an accepted medical use and it's not so addictive, it's going to be a triumph of politics over science. This isn't about the science of marijuana becoming less harmful or less addictive. This is purely an effort to assert politics over the science, and that's disappointing. As I said, Schedule 3 drugs, they are supposed to be distributed, and they're supposed to be dosed, dispensed, distributed by licensed pharmacists who are not in any position to dose and dispense a plant because we don't have any other plants that go through our local pharmacies. And there is a real concern we have about unregulated dispensaries being able to move these and other drugs. As I said, it's just a backdoor, it's a sidewards approach to legalization. And it's a big disappointment because it creates a lot more complications for workplace testing. Next slide, please. So, how's it going to affect DOT testing and non-regulated testing if it becomes Schedule 3 or when it becomes Schedule 3? First of all federal drug testing would stop because, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, President Reagan's executive order does not give any authority to HHS to certify laboratories to test. DOT, under that Omnibus Act, the shotgun wedding, can't do drug testing unless they're using HHS certified labs. That was that joining that is inseparable now. So DOT would lose authority literally overnight. You wouldn't have to wait for a rule change because there would be no more certified laboratories immediately. And who does this impact? We're talking about airline pilots, school bus drivers, tractor trailer drivers, locomotive engineers, transit bus and subway operators, mariners, pipeline operators, and others. So, again, why is this a problem? It's a problem because DOT and HHS are limited by the executive order. We did get information through to President Trump before he signed his executive order that we really needed him to expand the authority of HHS to continue to test for this, and he chose not to include that. Whether it was his personal decision or it just got lost in the pipeline, the reality is this is very difficult for us. And what does that mean? It means that not only would DOT and HHS testing stop, so all federal testing outside of the Department of Defense, the military would still be tested, but the civilian testing would stop. Over 23 of the states in this country require companies to follow DOT and HHS, or DOT or HHS, for their company testing. Because the state said, hey, this is reliable, this is fair. You need to follow the feds when you do your company program. So do a DOT-like program. All those programs would stop right away too, because there'd be no more certified labs. And the DOT wouldn't be testing for marijuana. Next slide, please. So covered most of this. And basically, oh, one more thing. It leaves the states who have recreational marijuana in an odd place because the rescheduling only addresses medical use. And I say medical use. What happens if you have legalization? That is still illegal. That is still contrary, even if it is rescheduled to Schedule 3. So it's a huge mess. Next slide, please. Now, before I get into what to do as an employer, I'll tell you one thing. Even though this is a huge mess, for many years now, I've been working on something that we call the safety carve out. And that was originally designed, and it was in the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Act, that had gone on for the last, oh gosh, until about the year, what was it, 2022 was the last version of it. But throughout the years, the safety carve out was going into the legalization, the MORE Act. And it said, regardless of the legalization of marijuana, the feds and DOT will still continue to test the people who were subject to testing at the levels that they were subject to testing for. We now have another safety carve out that is geared more toward the rescheduling. And it says the same thing, that regardless of the scheduling of marijuana, DOT, HHS will continue to test their respective employees for the substance. Since we did not get it in through the executive order, I've been working with the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association and DASA and others to talk to people on Capitol Hill, as well as talking to people in the administration and letting them know that we do need a safety carve out. And there are several people on the Hill who are interested in this. Years ago, when I had discussions with the marijuana industry, folks, we had a discussion and we said, hey, how are you guys in this industry going to feel if there is a major commercial accident right after you get your points through, right after you get legalization through then or now rescheduling? Right after that, what happens in the aftermath of a big accident like Chase, Maryland? One, we stop and we pause because of the tragedy of the loss of human lives. And secondly, Congress jumps on it because everybody wants to know Congress has got this. Congress is fixing this. Congress will reverse this. So for the marijuana industry, there is no reason why they shouldn't want the safety carve out because it protects workplace safety and health. Next, now we're on this slide. So let's talk about what you need to know to maximize the effectiveness of your workplace policies. I would say update your policy now. Think about what you're going to do if it is rescheduled. And you can plan your policies just like we're talking about with the safety carve out, regardless of the scheduling of marijuana. X is our policy. Regardless of the scheduling of marijuana, Y is what happens if it's determined that you are using marijuana at work or in your current capacity. Those provisions must be consistent with your state law. So I would recommend everybody, as you're working on your policies, I know you work with the National Drug Free Workplace Alliance. I know I've spoken with them too about some lawyers who deal in this area, but get somebody who's familiar with your state law and really have them work on this No one has to allow an employee to work impaired, not in any of the 50 states. But what happens after you've made that determination is a totally different question. In New York, you're not going to be able to fire people for marijuana use. Even if it's a positive, you're not going to be able to. So if you're an employer in New York, you probably want to think through what exactly you want to do so that you remove the person from the workplace if they're not appearing to be well enough to do their job. If you don't have negative repercussions on their job, then you're not necessarily going to be overreaching. So, remember I gave you the example of COVID and I gave you the example of the flu. What are you doing right now in your workplace if it seems like somebody just doesn't have the capacity to work? That there's a problem. What are you doing today? And is that consistent with your state law? I wouldn't wait until the federal government moves marijuana to Schedule 3 to update my policy. I would say, let me think. How do I want to approach people who are showing signs of impairment? And it could be a medical issue. Someone could have an undiagnosed or diagnosed medical issue that they're not sharing with you. So again, you want a lawyer because you don't want to step right into an Americans with Disabilities Act issue because you're harming a person who is actually sick, not using substances. They're just ill. So that's why your policy needs to be crafted, needs to be humane. It needs to, if you're dealing with somebody who is in recovery, you want to have a recovery friendly policy. That doesn't mean you need to let them use again. Some people are not covered by HIPAA, or I'm sorry, by the Americans with Disabilities Act when they're an active user. Everybody's covered when they're in recovery. So the Americans with Disabilities Act does not allow people to have active drug use issues, substance abuse disorders, but it does protect them when they're trying to recover from one. Next slide, please. So when you're updating your company's non-regulated policy, as I said, it needs to be consistent with state law. It absolutely does. So you need to think about what will a marijuana positive test result mean for your employee? And that's presuming that you can do a test in your state. There may be other ways of addressing that impairment. Will you require an employee with a positive test result to seek professional help, pass a return to duty test after a violation of your policy? Recovery friendly workplaces can benefit both the employer and the employee. The employee keeps their job. The employee gets to demonstrate to you their loyalty. The employer doesn't have to pay to train somebody new. The employer has the opportunity to show some compassion. There are a lot of great reasons to have a recovery friendly workplace. So don't just think about zero tolerance and I'm going to fire them and get them away from my people if they have sinned. Let's take a look at what does your state law look like and what are your options and what does a recovery friendly workplace look like for you? Because it may in the long run save you an awful lot of money. Next slide, please. So again, I'm emphasizing consistent with state law. When you decide what you clearly want and do not want to allow, make sure it's consistent with state law. Are you going to ban the use and or possession of marijuana on your premises? If it becomes a Schedule 3 drug, a lot messier because then it's a drug prescribed by a doctor and used for medical purposes. That's where you want your local council to talk to you about the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's where you want them to talk to you about your state laws. Are you going to ban the use or possession of marijuana while the employee is performing duties for you on and off the premises? Might be a little bit more doable. If an employee is taking hydrocodone because they had surgery 2 weeks ago, you don't have to let them perform while they're impaired. There may be administrative functions you can give them. There may be something else if there is a medical issue and they need a reasonable accommodation. But again, that opens a whole nother area of law where you need to work through that with your attorneys. And will you terminate an employee for violating your policy? And again, that's an area where in New York, you're not going to be able to do that if your policy says you can't use marijuana in the workplace and they use it, you can't just up and terminate them. New York is very strict about what they allow as employment repercussions. So again, I can't emphasize enough, whatever you do has to be consistent with state law. Next slide, please. So I've said this in almost every slide. Remember, no employer ever needs to allow an employee to work while impaired. And that's really the bottom line. And I think that is it for the substantive slides. Is the next one, Heather, the closing slide of the presentation? Yes. So now we're ready for questions. And we got a couple in advance. So Heather, do you want to lead on those?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to stop the share and I will put it back up as we get further on, but this way we can see each other. I can prompt you for a few things. All right, we did get a couple questions as we were here live, so I'm going to start with those. And I just want to say too, I appreciate all of this. These are questions that we get all the time. There's no one size fits all kind of answer, and it's really hard to take a look at all of these different rules and all of these different laws for different states, even different regions. Some cities and counties have their own particular rules and regulations about what you can and cannot do. But I think your message.
Oh, can I add one thing to that just to blow everybody's mind? Do y'all know the city of Denver, Colorado has legalized cocaine?
I'm learning something new at this very moment.
Of Colorado has not legalized it. So you can possess, publicly use cocaine in Denver. Once you leave the Denver city limits, you can be arrested.
Wow.
But cocaine use is fully legal in Denver.
So
that's a fun one. Hopefully you don't have any employers in Denver because I'm not going to address that one today.
Yeah, definitely that you certainly want to seek specific legal counsel there. But it just goes to show how regardless of where you are, and especially if you have employees that are in different places, different rules can apply to them and you want to be ready for those. And it's a tricky situation. So that's the basis of everything we're talking about. We do have this question, and then you did touch on this a little, but for many of us, I think it's really hard to wrap our heads around the idea that marijuana, if rescheduled to Schedule 3, will be removed from the DOT panel. The regulations do state, in the interest of commercial motor vehicle safety, that we're going to prescribe these regulations that establish a program to conduct testing for operators of commercial motor vehicles for the use of controlled substances and the use of alcohol. So that's a very broad statement. I mean, amidst all of the thousands of regulations that there are. But I think, like you alluded to, it comes back to this marriage between the DOT and the HHS about the Schedule 1 and 2, which is not including the Schedule 3.
Right.
So
right. And
maybe just if you could touch a little bit more on that, the idea for a safety carve out that we're.
Yeah. And again, this is a subject I have been advocating for the last 15 years. While I was a Fed, I had discussions with congressional staff and said, so what do you want us to do if you guys legalize this? Because you're considering the MORE Act, and what do I do next? And that's when we started drafting the early versions of the safety carve-out. And as a matter of fact, the staffer I worked with at that point was absolutely brilliant. And she is now head of the National Transportation Safety Board, Chair Jennifer Homendy. So that was a subject that we really were concerned about a long time ago. And I'm really grateful to the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association for lifting up that challenge. And they have been not lobbying, but advocating in their advocacy days where they bring people who are their members who do grassroots discussions with their congressional folks, whether it's their senator or their member of Congress, in their home office, in their national office. The idea is to explain to them that, hey, did you know that this is going to happen? Airline pilots, school bus drivers, they're not going to be tested anymore. And I'm concerned. And I tell you, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, it's still about safety, and those issues are not partisan issues. And so, as I've spoken to Democrats and Republicans, they've said, actually, I really do care about this. And what can we do to make a difference? How can we spearhead this? So, stay tuned. I would say I would encourage people to follow the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. You do not have to be a member in order to tap into their website, in order to see some of these things. A lot of associations do tighten up their websites and provide member only access, and DACE is not like that. And as a matter of fact, every Wednesday they have a town hall meeting, which I will leave promptly at 1:59 from this to go over and speak on the NDASA weekly town hall. But again, that's something that's open to non-members, where you can hear what's going on, you can ask questions about your drug testing programs, DOT and non-DOT. But it's an open forum every Wednesday from 2 to 3. And then NDASA carries these things forward. And NDASA really brings its voice to the people who are making these policy decisions. They talk to the executive branch, they talk to the legislative branch, and it's really important to all of us. And as you said, getting our minds wrapped around something that makes no sense. The reason why people aren't wrapping their minds around it comfortably is because it makes no sense. Why would we reschedule marijuana? I get it. Legalization, I get that. I understand that. I saw that coming. It was when the Biden administration threw rescheduling into the mix that I just went, wait, what? And actually, when the Biden administration came out with this, interestingly enough, the marijuana periodicals said, whoa, 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 that's not what we want. We don't want pharmacists. We don't want prescriptions. We don't want FDA oversight. That wasn't what we thought we were signing up for. So it kind of is a mess.
Yeah, I think that's the conclusion that we come to today is it is a mess. Um, and I think it's really important to highlight that so many times, so many of these issues can become, one side of the street or the other, but safety is not one of those issues. Especially safety around people, your school bus drivers, the safety around the people that we care about and love, could very well be jeopardized by this. And we're hoping to put in, that the folks will agree with us and put in the things that will keep people safe.
Exactly. And, so far, I haven't met one person on the Hill or in the administration who says, "Well, I really want my airline pilot to toke it up before he
Right.
flies. I really want my school bus driver to use a few
When you put it
before they
that way, people, it
transport."
seems so obvious.
Right. And so we are getting some traction. And I remain cautiously optimistic that that's going to take us somewhere. Because again, we're not touching the bigger issues. We're touching that this was just a really ineffective solution to the problems that are out there regarding marijuana and its legalization.
Yep, absolutely. We have another question, and this is just kind of about non-DOT drug tests, which I am vaguely aware of, familiar with, but don't know all the details of. But they generally do, because they have the 10 drug panel, include some Schedule 3 drugs. And it's just a matter of that either needs to be disclosed to an employer or HR department or whoever it may be, or an MRO, to say that, your doctor says, yes, we've prescribed this for this reason. You can take this for this, but they might be removed and put on like administrative duties or something like that.
Right.
And that's, I mean, a lot of time it's what's recommended. But again, to your state, region, city, county may have specific rules and regulations about exactly what you can test for, whether it's pre-employment testing versus um, any of these other types of testing, especially after an accident or a reasonable suspicion kinds of testing. So looking at what you're allowed to do for those as well is pretty important.
Right. And you conveyed to me one of the questions somebody asked in the beginning before the webinar took place was, if marijuana laws keep changing, is testing still worth the hassle? And I think it really is, because remember, we want to deter conduct. Testing, unless you're doing 100% testing, when everybody shows up for every shift,
Right.
we're doing it as a deterrent, not as a method of pure detection. And so once somebody kind of lets down their guards and start using, that's when we've started to lose the fight because we're losing them to the substance. But when somebody says, hey, you know what? I wouldn't try it because I love my job. That that changes lives. And
Absolutely.
years ago, it was during the Obama administration, I worked on a task group with the Deputy Attorney General, and it was called Drug Endangered Children. And one of the statistics that really rocked my world was 80% of the children who have a drug addicted parent will become a substance abuser. That's profound. So,
Oh,
in the
absolutely.
workplace, if you can prevent this from taking place in the first place, you're actually saving other generations too.
Yeah, I mean, the more we normalize, the more it becomes a thing that is around that seems normal, even as much as we know it may endanger people, children, workers, everybody's safety. Um,
Right.
we're looking to focus on the impairment. Now, impairment can be one of those tricky legal words. Again, seek legal counsel, but having a space in your policies that your employers, your employees are very aware of that you are not allowed to work while impaired, whether what that impairment comes from, and a way to document that impairment and to discuss, well, what happens if you believe I'm impaired? What are the next steps? How do I get help if help is something that I need? That's
Right. And since its
putting people first.
inception, the DOT program has included that rehabilitative component.
Yes.
And, I would be remiss if I did not mention Dr. Donna Smith is one of the participants on this, or one of the attendees on this.
Mm-hmm.
Donna, I saw your name come up on the webinar chat list. And Dr. Smith was the one who initially created these regulations for the U.S. Department of Transportation. And those were so wisely set and so well designed, especially considering the short period of time they had to work with. But again, there's a rehabilitative component. We've never believed in throwing somebody away. That's a human being who has that test result. We've never believed in throwing that person away when we worked on this as feds. So again, Dr. Donna Smith deserves so much credit as really the founder of
Absolutely.
all the good things about DOT testing.
And it's part of the reason why, recovery ready workplaces, we really advocate for those. The ultimate decision, of course, is up to the employer, but we do have ADA protections for people in recovery because we want to get people to a place where they are not using whatever the
Exactly.
substance may be, and that they can work safely, they can live safely. So absolutely. Another question come into, and again, please keep those questions popping in. Um, Oh, this is one that I had on my list too. Given everything we've seen, it's probably not likely, but you never know. One thing we never know what will happen. Um, what do you think the chances are of that they change their mind and move rescheduling to Schedule 2?
Oh, I would love it. It'll still be a headache for our medical review officers.
Of course.
But compared to Schedule 3, it'd be a cakewalk. But in all seriousness, it still goes back to it. Are we going to be using pharmacies or are we going to be using dispensaries? And can dispensaries dispense other Schedule 2 drugs like opioids? It still keeps that door open,
Yeah.
but it would totally save the DOT in the federal picture. But President Trump was very clear in his executive order. He wants it rescheduled to 3. So if Attorney General Pam Bondi comes back with Schedule 2, there may be a new Attorney General.
You never know. That's one
You
thing
never know.
the future is uncertain. There's no
And
doubt.
I admire her stance and her work on prevention and in opposition to marijuana becoming a problematic issue in Florida. I respect that. But she's also between a rock and a hard place because the marijuana advocates lobbied hard and paid well for this administration to issue the order that the president issued in December.
Yeah, it is a tricky situation overall, and it certainly would leave more space for even the non-regulated DOT testing because those labs would still be open and still be able to be used. You could say, hey, we're mimicking what the federal programs do.
Right.
But you never know what the future may bring. So it's a definite maybe.
Well, but it's unlikely because of this executive order.
Yes,
Highly
absolutely. That's why we're here
unlikely.
today to talk about it.
Exactly. Exactly. The executive order kind of knocked that down a notch. Under the Biden administration, and DESA actually argued that please don't make it Schedule 3. If you have to do something, make it Schedule 2 and just make sure there's very clear guidance for medical review officers, pharmacies, and pharmacists.
To make those judgments on the impairment while working, for sure. And then we talk a little bit about this in our policy making, but just the how does the relationship work between we have to do federal DOT testing, but my state says such and such is illegal, such and such is legal, recreational is so. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Sure. If you're talking about conducting federal drug testing, if you're under a DOT regulated program, then there's no issue at all because there's a legal doctrine that goes back a couple hundred years called preemption, and the feds preempt the state law. So New York may say you can't fire an airline pilot over their DOT positive, and they can regulate that, but that pilot still has repercussions under the federal regulations, which will include revocation of his or her pilot certificate. So New York State isn't going to stop that, but they may tell you you can't fire them. In most states, again, the states handle the employment repercussions. So if your state's going to be invasive at all, it's going to be in what you can do to the person after their positive test result. But the feds are going to take preemption even in states that have loosened the restrictions on marijuana if it's federal testing. Now, if you're doing a DOT-like program in a state where they allow medical marijuana or they allow recreational marijuana, then you don't have those preemption protections. You're not required by the feds to do this testing. Therefore, you're quite a bit on your own. And again, a reason to be very friendly with your local council who are good on these issues. You don't want to just go to your local personal injury lawyer. You don't want to just go to your local corporate counsel. You want to find somebody who has that specialty in HR and drug testing or just specifically drug testing. And there are resources out there. Heather can help you connect to those.
Wonderful. I appreciate you speaking on that too, because it is a little bit of it's a lot of bit of a muddy swamp to get through, even just in those things that you want to make sure that your policy very clearly states who is covered by those regulations, because an airline pilot may be, one thing, but the person working the front desk can be something entirely different, though they're both employed by you, maybe following the same things.
Right.
Another question, and you may not know as much about the scientific part of it. I know a little bit, but the testing for impairment and not just a threshold of how much THC or how much of an intoxicating substance the actual part of it may be in someone's body is just it's a subjective thing trying to be tested by objective testing, which is
There, there
almost
is no drug
impossible to do.
testing. There is no drug testing whatsoever for any substance other than alcohol that will definitively show impairment. What the police use are drug recognition experts. There's a lot of research going on out there for cognitive functioning tests to be done in conjunction with chemical testing. So, for example, I know University of Massachusetts at Amherst was pioneering a program where they had a test for the employee to take on an iPad. And there are certain colors that are harder for some people to see when they're using marijuana. The eye-hand coordination reaction time is definitely impacted by marijuana. It can be a day, 2, 3, 4 days later. But still, the idea is, are you showing cognitive as well as chemical signs? And in some states, again, talk to your local council. If it's not federal testing,
Right.
are you allowed to actually implement drug reasonable suspicion? Because you don't have to let people operate impaired. But I would think in most states, you would still have some opportunity to conduct testing. But cognitive testing is a good idea to have to go along with that. And again, when you're looking at these things and you're trying to determine methodologies, be careful of snake oil salesmen
Yes.
because there are no tests for impairment. And if somebody tries to sell you something other than alcohol impairment, then it's snake oil because it is not approved. It is not recognized by the federal government, nor really is it recognized at the state level. Your drug recognition expert who can do that cognitive testing or other things where you're showing cognitive inabilities that are relevant to the job. Those are things that you're going to want to look at more seriously.
And we here at NIDWA, we have trainings for reasonable suspicion trainings, especially for supervisors, which the DOT requires. That we really recommend them just because, again, it's something observable that you can make as measurable as possible. Say for this long at this time we notice this symptom is certainly not going to hurt if you're trying to prove something that is impairment. So making use of those. That does put us at time. I do need to let Patrice go, but if you've joined us today, we're so grateful for you joining us. I will just put the slides back up just so where you can find her. Again, I will follow up with some of this information for you. You'll get a copy of
Thank you,
the
everybody, for your time and for
Yes.
your attention. And if you're watching this as a recording, thank you for that too.
Yeah. We will have this recording available for you as well. So here's all of our info. We've already done the questions bit. This is where you find us and just how you connect with Drug Free America Foundation and the National Drug Free Workplace Alliance. So thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you, Patrice. I know there's many more questions we could have answered, so we'll have to have you on again in the future.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
And fingers
hope to
crossed
see
for
some of
everybody.
you on Town Hall.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye-bye.